A Quebec author faces child pornography charges over a retelling of Hansel and Gretel. I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri platform. We've got a real, somewhat weird, somewhat crazy story today. Vice reports that a Quebec author is being charged with child pornography over his Hansel and Gretel retelling. Now, before we get too deep into that, for those who didn't read the original story, it's basically a tale about a poor family who abandons their children and a witch takes them in. The witch then tries to fatten them up so she can eat them, but at the end, she gets outplayed by Hansel and Gretel. And hopefully that's not a spoiler. I feel like if a book is already going on, 100 years, spoiling it isn't possible anymore. So, fast forward to now, this Quebec author, his name is Yvan Godbout, and his publisher are charged with producing and distributing child pornography. This is so crazy to me. It kind of cracks me up. So how does that relate to Hansel and Gretel? It's a pretty serious charge, and why am I laughing about it? Well, this is the reason. The author created a dark retelling of the story, and he added in a section where the father sexually assaults the daughter. Supposedly it was a paragraph long, and obviously I'm not laughing about the subject matter. It's very grave and it's serious, but I am chuckling at the idiocy of our court system. This man wrote about a sexual assault piece in his novel, and now he's facing child pornography charges. It's weird, and it's going to get weirder as we go on. So how did this happen? Well, one reader freaked out while they were going through this part of the novel, and they called the police. Following that, the author and the publisher were arrested. Now, I can only imagine the reaction of the author. You're just in bed sleeping, and all of a sudden the cops break into your house, you get arrested, and you ask what for, and they tell you child pornography. The first thought that comes to your mind must have been, they've got the wrong person. What are they even talking about? And then the proof comes out. They hold up the book that you wrote about Hansel and Gretel, and they say this is evidence of the charges. Wow. Now, we should actually establish a couple more core tenets before we go on. First of all, child abuse is obviously horrendous and needs to be met with consequences, but we need to be able to distinguish between reality and fiction, between advocating for it and condemning it, between visuals and simple text like a story. It appears to me that these police, these courts, and those judges did not do that, and also the reader who called the police in the first place. It also appears to me that the author touched a sensitive topic, and now he might end up in jail because of it and have his life destroyed. There is a difference between him writing to an audience of pedophiles and trying to incite them to act on their whims versus him retelling a horrifying reality that does happen to people. You have to add a little bit of reason here and goodwill. If he wrote a book titled How to Do X and Y to Kids, How to Be a Child Predator 101, and it was a guide on how to do these heinous things and whatnot, then of course you have grounds for dismissal. But when he is talking about a fairy tale and he adds in a component that is a real world issue and he adds it into the plot, that is not the same thing. We need to be able to make this distinction rationally, otherwise you ensure that artists and authors cannot express certain themes for fear of legal consequences. That's not a good thing because you shut down conversation on touchy subjects. And who knows, if you go down that slippery slope, one day, the people who get to define what a touchy subject is may be the wrong people, the ones who you don't want having that power. Now, also, to add to the author's case, there are a couple of key facts to keep in mind. Vice states that the book was not marketed to children. It contains no explicit visual images. There was also a content warning on the back of the book, and the scene is meant to be horrifying, not erotic. In other words, it wasn't meant to get the audience turned on, but the exact opposite, to expose them to the horrors of sexual abuse, and I don't see the problem with that. There were also no visuals and no real children were a part of the scene. It was just imaginary. It is a fiction, it's a story, it's a fairy tale. A gruesome theme does occur, that's agreed, but going to jail, being charged with child pornography because you wrote about it, it seems out of place unless we're missing something critical here. Actions like this, setting people and authors and artists to jail because they're writing about things that we don't like, because we're offended or triggered by it, it's a slippery slope and it sets a couple of precedents. So first, What constitutes child abuse and child pornography? This might be what they're trying to make the poster boy today, but we've had things like Family Guy. Think about Stewie Griffin. That's what comes to my mind first when you think about a child being put in precarious situations. Stewie has been running around his house naked an untold amount of times in that show. He's done very suggestive things before. That's a baby who can talk, and there's actually a visual. Would that be considered child abuse, child pornography, and should the courts be going after the creators of Family Guy as well? Should we be considering this pedophile content? I'm not too sure the answer is yes in that case. And here's the second consideration. Because you're putting authors in jail for talking about topics like this, they're going to feel like they cannot touch subjects of this nature out of fear of persecution. And that might extend far beyond child pornography. They may try to shy away from things like rape, from difficult conversations about real-world occurrences. There will be a lack of conversation about these topics that's the opposite of what we want. We want to hear more about it so we can better prepare and find ways to tackle the issue. Stifling conversation is very rarely a good idea, and it is just a tool of subjugation. This is, of course, in the context of this author here. I'm not talking about the people who are actually catering to a pedophile audience, and they're making these kind of books to get you off. That was very clearly not the scope of what's happening here. And there is the third consideration, the author himself. If guilty, if they prove that he is actually trafficking child pornography when very clearly he is not, this man's life is as good as ruined. A convicted child pornographer does not have many prospects left in life, and for real criminals, that is very fitting. But for this person, who remade Hansel and Gretel, and he added in a controversial scene, I don't think the supposed crime fits the punishment. It's almost akin to arresting a musician for something they say in a song, or arresting an actor for a part they played, even though they haven't even done anything. It's simply a work of art, and that realization is lacking from this case right now. At the same time, advocates such as civil liberty groups have spoken out against the issue, and they're trying to raise awareness of it. They've also written a letter to Quebec's Minister of Justice. They state that the arrest is a terrible exercise of your quasi-judicial powers, and it is straining the limits of reason to suggest the novel is child pornography. I think that's true. It really is a stretch of his power and a stretch of the imagination to be making this claim. To be able to arrest people because you don't like what they've written about, because one concerned reader has an issue with it, here's a newsflash. Any reader can call the police about any topic that they want to, and they can claim to be petrified by the audaciousness of it. That does not mean that the author is guilty of a crime. I believe that the civil liberty groups have it largely correct. It's pretty baffling how this entire situation even got this far in the first place. Nobody along the chain of command saw this and thought, we might be going a little bit too hard here. This may be somewhat a waste of our time, a waste of tax dollars, and it's a frivolous proposition that's being brought to us. But no, it never happened. And even going back to the person who first made that phone call, they overreacted like crazy. To call the police over that is beyond me. I'm not too sure if they had a crazy out-of-body experience or something like that, but it just doesn't seem like the appropriate response to this book here. And that's especially true when this book has been reviewed by a lot of people online. I believe it was on Goodreads and it got a 3.8 out of 5 or something along those lines. So it's not as if massive swaths of people were condemning the book, giving it 1-star reviews or something along those lines. It seems like an outlier claim. Now, the real complex issue comes from interpreting the Canadian law. So Canada's Supreme Court has ruled that restrictions on expressive material are justifiable to the extent that such material poses a risk of harm to children. That's a little bit vague, but they get even more vague in this next part. The work violates the law, and the work would be something like this book in question, if it fuels the sexual fantasies of pedophiles and could incite them to offend. Here's the thing with that. Whenever you mention or bring up or touch upon the subject of child abuse, that is presumably going to fuel the fantasies of pedophiles because that is seemingly what they are interested in. It takes away the motivation from the equation. If you're simply highlighting a very horrible situation that tries to explain the psychological and emotional trauma of a child in that situation, you're going to be charged with trafficking child pornography apparently. The bar isn't really set too high with that and does not account for any such nuance. The second part of the law also falls victim to that same vagueness. It's setting the bar as inciting a pedophile. I'll go back to the Family Guy episode that I talked about. Stewie Griffin has numerous scenes in the show where he's running around in his underwear or naked or doing crazy things at the same time. I guarantee you that show may have incited some type of behavior in some portion of the pedophile community. That fits the criteria of potential incitement, potentially inciting their fantasies. But the bottom line really is that we don't know for sure how the pedophile or how a pedophile is going to react to that. Should Family Guy be banned from Canada and a lawsuit be launched? You could actually argue that if you're not doing that for Family Guy, you have less ground to do it for a book, because the book has no visual imagery. It is simply text. But Family Guy, you actually have a baby you can see doing these things. The court then also adds a caveat to the law, and it's a little bit of leeway for art. It says that art is not subject to the same rules that apply across the board. The question is, does this novel count as art? So, for the prosecutors to convict the author, they have to do two things. The first is to demonstrate that, what we just talked about, that the work, the novel, can incite a pedophile to commit a crime. The second is to prove that the novel is not considered art in this case, so that extra protection can be removed and he'll be vulnerable to the lawsuit. This sounds like a fairy tale right now, honestly. If the prosecutors pull this off, I'll be shocked. That's a pretty big plot twist. To have someone jailed for child pornography related material without actually being a child pornographer sounds out of the blue. So some legal experts chimed in and they gave their thoughts on the matter. One says that there is no shortage of literature in every genre that deals with difficult subjects, often in explicit terms. If authors have to fear prosecution for addressing them, the impact on Canada's cultural life will be severe. That sounds accurate to me, and it's a concern that I have, but I would actually take it even further. The impacts would go beyond just culture. It would pave the road to tyranny. What happens when talking about something that the government or a support group doesn't like becomes a crime? First of all, you get that silence, and they become able to control the narrative. Keep in mind, too, that the author didn't abuse any children. We're not talking about an actual pedophile here. It's a work of fiction meant to get you thinking. It also isn't even a work that's framed in an erotic fashion. He's not trying to get you turned on at the thought of Hansel or Gretel being abused. Keep in mind as well that freedom of expression is a core tenet of our Constitution for a reason. It's a safeguard against tyranny. I don't know what kind of precedents these courts are trying to establish, but this just reeks of bad judgment across the board. Nobody's thinking logically about this case. Next thing you know, the author of a Holocaust book is being sent to jail for genocide. The author who wrote about SARS is being sent to jail for biological warfare. The author who wrote about somebody getting raped is being sent to jail for rape now. These things are just crazy. And of course I have to realize that what I just laid out is the reductio ad absurdum of the situation. It's obviously not going to be a likely outcome, but that's where things can go if we let them go to their logical consequences, to their ends. This is not a game that we're playing around with. It's someone's life that's being thrown away for a crime that seems to me not to be fitting of his actions. Another aspect of this entire situation that's baffling to me is that there seems to be a general consensus about it. Legal professors are telling people that it's a bad idea. Advocates are saying it's a bad idea. Everyday people like me think it's a bad idea. Who actually is out here pulling the strings thinking it's a worthwhile case to pursue? Maybe that one person who called the police in the first place, but why are the courts even entertaining this idea? Okay, do your investigation from the police side of things. Look into the book, read the book. I'm sure that will prove to you whether or not it's an accurate accusation. But to actually go through a trial, to get prosecutors on the case trying to convict these people, and it's not even just the author, it's the publisher too. This thing is stemming far beyond what I would consider reasonable limits. And there's actually a possibility that they win the case, that these guys go to jail because of it. There's two criteria that have to be proven in court. The first is pretty vague. You have to show to the judge that somehow, some way, this content may in fact incite a pedophile to do something, or it's stirring up their sexual fantasies. I think that might not be too difficult to prove because the abuse of a child sexually is presumably a fantasy of a pedophile. That's in the book. That's actually what happened. So that first check mark right there, you could get away with it. Now the second part is simply to talk about whether or not it's art. If it's considered art, there is some leeway and it can get tossed out. I'm not too sure how they're going to go about that. It seems to me that this fiction, this novel, is art, and that could be the saving grace of the author that stops him from going to jail. But who knows? Crazier things have already happened in this case itself, and to even get to the point where you're being saved by that last grace is crazy to me. But we'll follow the story and keep you up to date. So, that now brings me to the end of today's conversation. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. You can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at Perri Platform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.